There is a problem with the Sphinx, and most of the people who study Egypt for a living do not want to talk about it. The textbooks say the Sphinx was carved around 2,500 years before the Common Era by the workmen of the pharaoh Khafre. But there is a man, a quiet, careful, Yale-trained Boston University geologist named Robert Schoch, who has spent 30 years measuring the wrong thing on the right monument. He has measured the patterns of erosion cut into the limestone walls of the enclosure where the Sphinx sits. And what those patterns show, he says, is something that simply cannot be reconciled with the Khafre date. The walls have been eroded by rainfall, the kind of rainfall that requires not centuries but millennia to carve those channels. And if Schoch is right, and his evidence is, in pure geological terms, almost embarrassingly clear, then the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. The Sphinx is at least 7,000, possibly 12. Tonight we are going to walk into that question slowly. We are not going to argue. We are not going to insist. We are going to look at what the geology actually shows and at what the orthodox Egyptologists have said in reply, and at the long quiet weight of evidence that sits, even now, carved into the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. So let your shoulders drop, and there is nothing you need to do for the next half hour except listen to a story about a great stone lion in the desert that may be much, much older than anyone has been allowed to say. The wind has been moving across that limestone for a very long time. Let us walk, in our minds, to the place where this argument lives. Let us imagine that we have arrived at the Giza Plateau in the soft light of an Egyptian morning, just before the sun has cleared the eastern horizon. The Great Pyramids are behind us. The desert opens out to our south, and below us, sunk into a deep rectangular pit, cut down into the limestone bedrock, sits the Sphinx. The first thing that surprises every visitor is that the Sphinx does not stand on the surface of the desert. It sits inside a trench. The trench is roughly the same shape as the Sphinx itself, a long rectangular hollow about 60 feet deep, and the walls of the trench rise up around the body of the lion on 3 sides. Those walls are the same limestone the Sphinx itself was carved from. Whoever cut the Sphinx out also cut the trench. It is the walls of that trench, not the body of the Sphinx, that hold the geological evidence. The body has been restored, recarved, patched and refaced many times over its long life. But the trench walls are bedrock. They have not been touched. Whatever has weathered them is the original weather of the place where they were cut. Walk slowly along the western wall of the enclosure. Run your eye down the limestone. You will see something unmistakable. The wall is cut by deep vertical channels, not 1 or 2. Many. They run from the top of the wall toward the bottom, like the grooves left in a candle by hot wax that has run down its side. They are wide at the top, and they narrow as they descend. Some are several feet deep at their thickest point. This pattern is not subtle. You can see it from 100 meters away. Old photographs from the 1880s, before the modern restorations, show it even more clearly. It is, geologically speaking, the most obvious feature of the entire enclosure. For more than a century, the official explanation was simply that wind and sand had done this work. Egypt is a desert. Wind blows, sand abrades. Over 4,500 years, the desert had carved these patterns into the limestone, the way a slow river will carve a stone bed. That is the explanation Robert Schoch went to the Sphinx in the late 1980s intending to confirm. He was not looking to start a controversy. He was looking to add a small, careful geological footnote to a story everyone already knew. What he found, when he actually looked, did not match the story. To understand what Robert Schoch saw on those walls, we need to spend a few quiet minutes thinking about how rock weathers in a desert. This is the part of the story most people skip. It is the part on which everything else depends. Wind erosion has a signature. When wind moves across a rock surface for thousands of years, it carries fine grains of sand at low altitude, just inches above the ground. Those grains scour the rock at exactly that height. The result is that wind-eroded rock develops a very specific pattern. It tends to undercut. It hollows out the lower portions of cliffs and walls. It carves horizontal grooves and shelves. It leaves the upper portions relatively intact and bites into the lower portions. You can see this pattern across the Sahara. You can see it across the American Southwest. Anywhere wind has worked stone for long enough, the lower regions show the heaviest scouring, and the cuts run horizontally, parallel to the prevailing wind, parallel to the desert floor. This is what every geology student learns in their first semester. Wind cuts horizontally, wind cuts low, wind hollows out the bottom and leaves the top. Now there is a second pattern that wind produces in deserts, on softer rocks like sandstone. The wind isolates softer layers and erodes them faster than the harder layers above and below. The result is layered, banded weathering. You see it in the great mesas of the Sahara, those tall, flat-topped formations with horizontal stripes of differential erosion running across their faces. Both of these patterns, the horizontal scouring at low height and the layered banding on softer strata, are what mainstream Egyptology has, for over a century, said we are looking at on the Sphinx enclosure walls. Wind, they have said, just wind, for 4,500 years. The case is not absurd on its face. The body of the Sphinx itself, which sits up out of the trench and is exposed to the wind, does show some of the classic wind erosion signatures. The face has been worn. The neck has been thinned. Sand has, undeniably, done some of the work. But that is not the question. The question is whether wind alone can account for the deep vertical channels in the trench walls. The walls inside the trench, where the Sphinx itself sits inside its hollow, sheltered from the prevailing wind, mostly buried in sand for most of recorded history. Schoch's answer, after careful measurement, was no. Wind cannot. Water cuts rock differently from wind. The signature is unmistakable to anyone who has spent time looking at it. Water, unlike wind, is pulled by gravity. It runs from high places to low places. When water moves across the surface of a rock, it gathers into rivulets, and the rivulets cut downward in the direction of fall, in the direction of gravity. The channels are vertical, or near vertical. They are wide at the top, where many smaller streams have converged, and they narrow as they descend, where the gathered water has cut a single deeper groove. This is the pattern you see on any limestone formation in any temperate climate, where rainfall has been heavy enough, over long enough, to do real work. You see it in the Sapiens in France. You see it in the karst country of Slovenia. You see it on cliffs in Wales and in northern Spain. The vertical fluting that erosion leaves on weathered limestone is, for a working geologist, as unmistakable a fingerprint as any in nature. Robert Schoch went to the Sphinx enclosure in 1990 with 30 years of geological field experience behind him, and he looked at the walls. And what he saw on the western wall and on the southern wall was not wind erosion patterns at all. He saw textbook water erosion patterns, deep vertical channels, wide at the top, narrowing as they descended, rounded edges where the running water had smoothed the rock over centuries, karst-style fluting, identical to the patterns he had spent his career documenting on weathered limestone in temperate climates around the world. He measured the depth of the channels. He measured the width. He photographed them at every angle. He compared them, point for point, with documented water erosion features at sites with known histories. And the comparison was clean. Whatever had done this work had done it with rainfall. It was not subtle. It was not arguable on the geology alone. The question Schoch was forced to confront The moment he had finished his measurements was a simple one. How much rain does it take to do that to a limestone wall? And when, in the entire climatic history of the Egyptian desert, was there enough rain to do it? Because the modern desert receives, on average, less than an inch of rainfall in a year. To understand the climate problem, we have to take a brief, gentle journey backward through the long memory of the Egyptian landscape. The Sahara, of which Egypt is the eastern edge, has been a green and habitable place several times in the past 100,000 years. The most recent of those green periods is what climatologists call the African humid period. It began about 14,000 years ago as the last ice age was ending, and it lasted, with some fluctuation, until about 5,000 years before the Common Era. During that long stretch, nearly 9,000 years, the rain belts of the tropical monsoon swept further north than they do today. The evidence for this is overwhelming. There are dry lake beds across the western desert that once held standing water. There are river channels, wadis we now call them, that once carried real flowing rivers. There are cave paintings in the Gilf Kebir and at Wadi Sora showing hippos and crocodiles and herding cattle. Imagine grasslands stretching from the Atlas Mountains to the Nile, dotted with shallow blue lakes, dappled with acacia trees, full of animals and people. That landscape supported a sustained population of human beings for thousands of years. Some of those people, when the climate began to dry out around 5000 BCE, drifted east and settled in the Nile Valley. They are part of the long, deep prehistory that much later would become dynastic Egypt. But the rain stopped. By around 3000 BCE, when the first pharaoh was uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, the Sahara was already much as we know it today: hot, dry, almost rainless. Now hold that timeline in your mind for a moment. That means, by the orthodox account, the Sphinx was carved 2,500 years after the last of the heavy rainfall. If the trench walls have been eroded by rain, they cannot have been eroded after the Khafre date, which means the surface that took the water, the limestone wall of the Sphinx enclosure, had to already have been there to take it. Robert Schoch did not publish his findings in a popular book or on a television program. He published them in the way a serious geologist publishes anything, by presenting a paper at a professional conference. The conference was the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America, held in San Diego in the autumn of 1991. There is a particular quality to a serious academic conference room that is hard to describe to anyone who has not sat in one. The lights are dimmed. The slide projector hums. The audience is small, perhaps 100 geologists, mostly older men in tweed jackets and sensible shoes, perhaps some graduate students in the back rows taking notes. Schoch stood at the lectern and began to walk through his evidence. He showed the photographs of the enclosure walls. He showed the measurements. He showed the comparison with known water-eroded limestone formations from other parts of the world. He laid out the climate timeline. He concluded, calmly and without theatrical flourish, that the existing date for the Sphinx was geologically incompatible with the weathering on the trench walls. By how much, he could not say with precision, but likely by several thousand years. The geological audience reacted in the way working scientists usually react to a careful presentation of new data. They asked technical questions. They probed the methodology. They challenged some of the comparisons. But, by and large, they did not dismiss it. Geologists know weathering when they see it. The case Schoch laid out was internally consistent. The data was real. Whether the conclusion was right or wrong was a question that would have to be settled, but the question itself was a legitimate one. And then a strange thing happened. But word of Schoch's paper began to leak out, almost immediately, into the wider academic world. Within weeks, his colleagues in the Egyptology departments of major universities were being asked, by reporters, by colleagues, by curious students, what they thought. Their reaction was rather different. It was, in many cases, hostile. The Sphinx was their monument. The dating of the Sphinx was their territory. A geologist, however well credentialed, was wandering uninvited into a field that was not his, and he was suggesting, on the basis of evidence Egyptologists were not trained to evaluate, that they had been wrong about a foundational date for over a century. The argument was on. It is worth pausing here to remember how Robert Schoch had ended up at the Sphinx in the first place. He had not woken up one morning as a young geologist and decided to challenge mainstream Egyptology. He had been brought there. He had been brought there by a journalist named John Anthony West. John Anthony West was an unusual figure. He was a writer, a literary critic, an essayist, and by the late 1980s, the most articulate and persistent advocate of the proposition that the Sphinx was much older than the textbooks said. He was not an academic. He had no formal credentials in either Egyptology or geology, but he had spent decades reading deeply in the unconventional Egyptological literature, particularly the work of an early 20th century French scholar named Schwaller de Lubiche, who had, half a century earlier, casually mentioned in passing that the Sphinx looked to him like it had been weathered by water. That single observation, made by Schwaller de Lubiche in passing, lodged in West's mind. He travelled to Egypt repeatedly through the 1980s to see for himself. He took photographs. He wrote articles. He published a book called Serpent in the Sky in 1979. He was largely ignored. But West understood something important. He understood that an English literature critic, however persuasive in writing, could not by himself resolve a geological question. The argument needed a working geologist, someone with credentials, someone who could go to the Sphinx, look at the walls, take measurements, and bring the verdict back, not as a controversial opinion, but as a piece of straightforward science. He spent years looking for such a person. He approached several geologists, most of them politely declined. Then in 1990 he wrote to Robert Schoch at Boston University, who had recently become a tenured associate professor and had a substantial publication record on weathering in carbonate rocks. Schoch's first reaction was skepticism. He agreed to look at West's photographs more out of professional courtesy than out of expectation. But the photographs were striking. He found himself unable at distance to give a confident geological reading. He went with West in the spring of 1990. He spent days at the Enclosure, and he came home and wrote the paper that he would deliver at the Geological Society of America the following autumn. If it had not been for John Anthony West, that paper would never have been written. Now we must, as always, hear the other side. The mainstream Egyptological response to Schoch's work is serious, sustained, and worth understanding on its own terms. The most prominent figure on the Egyptological side is Zahi Hawass, who served for many years as the Secretary-General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, and who was, for a generation, the public face of Egyptian archaeology. The other major voice has been Mark Lehner, the American Egyptologist, who has spent more time than perhaps any other living person mapping and excavating the Sphinx and the surrounding plateau. Their case rests on several arguments. The first is contextual. The Sphinx sits within an architectural complex that is unmistakably Old Kingdom in style. The temple immediately to the east of the Sphinx Temple, is built of massive limestone blocks that were quarried from the very enclosure trench in which the Sphinx sits. The blocks bear the same stone signature, the same quarrying technique, the same wear patterns as confirmed Khafre-era construction elsewhere on the plateau. But every other line of evidence places those blocks in the 4th dynasty. The second argument is the cultural argument. There is no archaeological evidence at Giza for any human population sophisticated enough to undertake a project on the scale of the Sphinx prior to the Old Kingdom. Leading up to about 3000 BCE, has left us many remains across Egypt: burials, settlements, pottery, tools. And none of those remains suggests anything like the labour organisation or stoneworking skill required to carve a great limestone monument from bedrock. The third argument is geological, and it is the one most directly aimed at Schoch. Subsurface moisture they have proposed, seepage from below, salt crystallisation. None of these, they suggest, requires us to push the date of the Sphinx back into the prehistoric past. There has been, over the years, a steady back and forth in the academic literature. The substance of the debate has narrowed, but the substance has not been resolved. It is honest at this point to acknowledge that the orthodox case is not absurd. It rests on real evidence carefully gathered by careful scholars. If the rest of Egyptology is right, then there must be some non-rainfall explanation for the weathering, and the search for that explanation is a legitimate one. It is also honest to acknowledge that in pure geological terms, the rainfall explanation remains the simplest one. If we accept, even provisionally, that Schoch may be right, that the Sphinx may date to 7,000 years ago, or possibly 12, we run into a question that quietly reframes a great deal of human history. Who would have built it? There is no obvious answer. But there is, in the past 20 years, a body of new evidence that has made the question much less impossible than it once seemed. In the late 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began to excavate a low artificial hill in southeastern Turkey at a site the locals called Göbekli Tepe. What he found there has reshaped the conversation about prehistoric architecture. Beneath the hill were a series of stone enclosures, circular arrangements of carved limestone pillars, some of them 10 or 12 feet tall, decorated with reliefs of foxes and serpents and vultures and wild boars. The pillars were arranged with deliberate geometric care. The site had been built in stages over several centuries, and the dating, established by radiocarbon analysis of the surrounding deposits, was firm. The earliest layers at Göbekli Tepe are about 11,500 years old. They predate the dynastic Egyptian period by roughly 7,000 years. They predate the development of agriculture itself in that region by around 1,000 years. They are the work of hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet domesticated grain, who nonetheless organized themselves to quarry, transport, carve, and erect monumental stone architecture. This is, by every standard the textbooks gave us before 1995, supposed to have been impossible. Stone architecture required cities. Cities required agriculture. Agriculture came first, then villages, then towns, then monuments. Göbekli Tepe undid that sequence. The dating of Göbekli Tepe is interesting for a second reason. 11,500 years ago is roughly the moment of the Younger Dryas, a sharp, brief, intensely cold climatic event that interrupted the warming at the end of the last ice age. The Younger Dryas began around 12,800 years ago and ended around 11,700 years ago. It was, climatologically, the last great cold snap of the Ice Age, and the moment it ended, monumental stone architecture began. If you're inclined to think that Schoch's 12,000-year-old Sphinx is implausible, Göbekli Tepe is the inconvenient fact you must contend with. The capacity to do this kind of thing existed somewhere in the world 12,000 years ago. Whether the Sphinx is a Göbekli Tepe-style work by some now vanished culture in the Nile Valley before the rise of dynastic Egypt, we cannot say. But the door, once firmly closed, is now genuinely open. It is worth being clear, as we come toward the end of this story, about what the Schoch hypothesis is and what it is not. It is not a story about aliens. Robert Schoch has never, in any of his writings or talks, suggested anything of the sort. He is a geologist. He measures rocks. He has said simply and consistently that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls are inconsistent with a Khafre-era construction date and require a much earlier one. The implication is that some human population in the Nile Valley before the predynastic period carved the Sphinx. Who they were and what else they may have built or known is a question for archaeologists to answer, not for geologists to invent. It is not a story about lost civilizations in the dramatic sense, sunken Atlantises, vanished cities under the sand. It is a quieter story. It is the story of a culture that may have existed at the eastern edge of the African humid period, with sufficient skill to carve a great limestone lion out of the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, and which then, like Göbekli Tepe, was buried under the slow weight of subsequent history and forgotten. It is a story, in the end, about how easy it is to be wrong about how old something is when we judge it by the framework we already hold. The walls of the trench had been weathered by what we assumed was wind because the desert is a windy place. The dates we inherited from previous generations of scholars seemed firm because they had been quoted in textbook after textbook for over 100 years. And then a careful geologist looked at the walls in person and asked the simplest possible question, and the answer he found did not match what we had been told. For now, let that be enough. Let us not insist on more than the evidence supports. Let us hold both possibilities in our minds at the same time. Perhaps the truth, when it finally settles, will turn out to be some third thing none of us has yet imagined. Whatever it is, the great stone lion in the desert is keeping its own counsel. It has been keeping its own counsel for a very long time. It will keep it for a little longer. Your work today is done. Your shoulders are heavy. Your breath is slow. The room around you is warm. You are safe. You are exactly where you need to be. Let the slow patience of the desert carry you down into sleep the way the rain once, long ago, carried itself down the limestone walls beside the Sphinx, and the way the silence has carried the Sphinx forward, intact, ever since. Sleep well. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for letting us tell you a story. Comment your country and your time below.